Good afternoon. I'm Chirashri Dasgupta. I teach in the Center for the Study of Law and Governance. It is my pleasure and honor to stand here in the now hallowed JNU's Azadi Chowk to welcome all of you to the second lecture in the second phase of the JNU teaching titled Azadi, the Many Meanings of Freedom. Our speaker today is the well-known lawyer Sanjay Hegde, who is a senior advocate at the Supreme Court and was also standing counsel for Karnataka in the Supreme Court. He has also been an advisor to the Law Commission. An insightful scholar of history, Sanjay Hegde has written extensively on sedition laws, capital punishment, and more recently on the relationship between democracy, freedom, and dissent. A very warm welcome to Sanjay Hegde on behalf of JNUTA and all participants in today's teaching. Interestingly, on September 20th, 2010, an article titled The Many Meanings of Azadi was written by, hold your breath, Madhu Purnima Kishwar in the Times of India. In this article, Madhu Kishwar argued that most of us have been conditioned to believe that when Kashmiris come on streets demanding Azadi, they do so only at the behest of Pakistani agents. She goes on to say, in Patna or Mumbai, such protests are taken as a sign of disenchantment with state administration. But the same action in Kashmir is invariably interpreted as anti-national. People will respond to this by saying that in other parts of India, I'm quoting her, this is all quotes, okay? People don't start demanding Azadi when they come out to protest against the regional governments. But in other parts of India, Madhu Kishwar argues, protests against local governments are not crushed through the deployment of security forces using deadly weapons, as often happens in Kashmir. She goes on to say that lack of Azadi in Kashmir is visible on every road, in every muhalla, every town and village. Arbitrary arrests, crackdowns, custodial deaths, and disappearances are routine events. For example, this entire phase of violence in 2010 erupted because people who came out to protest against the wanton killing by the Jammu and Kashmir police of 17-year-old Tufail Mattu were met with bullets. That led to more protests, more injuries, and more deaths. At such times, the cry for Azadi is a desperate plea for a life of dignity, freedom from constant fear, and assertion of democratic rights, including the right to protest against the denial of fundamental freedoms promised by the Constitution of India. Madhu Purnima Kishwar, to the best of my knowledge, has not been called an anti-national and accused of sedition till date. Her rights as a citizen of India has been protected. In fact, as one of my colleagues earlier today pointed out in an informal discussion, that the Motilal Nehru Committee in 1928 premised its recommendations of the envisioning of free India on a Bill of Rights. And the role of the sovereign independent state and its apparatus, its various apparatus, as protecting and guaranteeing the rights which would be fundamental to citizenship of the free and democratic country of India. Sanjay Hegde, in a recent article, which was titled No Freedom Without Dissent, wrote, and I quote, "A democracy without a dissenter in it is impossible. Free men, and I hope women, in the exercise of free thought will give vent in free speech. No matter how abhorrent the thought or its manner of expression, a mature democracy will tolerate it and even encourage its publication." How have aspirations for freedom, for liberty, for liberation, in the multiple articulations that we have seen in the slogans, speeches, and lectures, which have defined people's struggles in this country, the multiple legacies of which we have seen articulated in our very own struggle that brings us together here today? Do these have any relationship with the multiple articulations of freedom as both liberty and liberation, which were the harbingers of the Constitution of India? To explore these questions, we look to Sanjay Hegde's lecture titled, Azadi, Is It in Our Constitution? Thank you, Sanjay Hegde.
Thank you, Professor. Friends at JNU, I come here first to stand with JNU I come here also as a representative of lawyers. Just as you have told the world that not all of JNU is against India or against or wants freedom from India, just as you have told the world that JNU has many voices and it is indeed a microcosm of what India is about, I also have come to tell you that not all lawyers are like those who honored you at Patiala House. I come in expiation. I come here to learn. I come here not to preach. I come just to talk to friends. And that is what we all are in this country, friends. We are people with multiple identities. I speak about 5 or 6 languages, and I'm comfortable in many of them. I am an atheist, an agnostic, and a believer, all simultaneously. But no one thing, no one quality defines a human being. No one ingredient is the test to tell whether you are national or anti-national. Our constitution has space for the believer, for the agnostic, for the dissenter, and for every shade of opinion. You see, the point is not whether Bharat Mata ki Jai. Now let's say it. Because once you've said it, that argument is behind you. So Bharat Mata ki Jai. And when we say Bharat Mata ki Jai, we speak not only of that one idol, that one flag-bearing deity that is pictured. When we speak of Bharat Mata, we speak of the tribal in Dantewada. We speak of those who are in some kind of struggle in Kashmir. We speak of the mothers of Manipur. We speak of the anti-nuclear protesters down there in the south. We speak of 1 million men, 1 billion men, 1 million mutinies. All of these continually gather stream, they went and they formed together this great country. Along with that, there are also people who work in their own way, who keep working for whatever vocation that life chooses for them. My vocation, in one sense, is of being a lawyer, of not fighting people like the Patiala House lawyers, but for fighting for people. And it is in this context, as somebody who has, I've not really studied the Constitution, I have worked with the Constitution. I have continually seen it evolve from time to time. And what I am trying to tell you all today is to give you an impressionistic view of constitutional development in this country. Over the years, from the time that we first wrote it, all those years back till 1950. You see, not many people realize that the Constitution came after great bloodshed. You see, the 40s were a decade of violence. You had the Second World War. You had the atom bomb. You had genocide of the Jews. And in our country, we had the Great Bengal Famine. After that, we had the partition. So if you take the 40s, they were such a violent decade. And so many people died. So many people were left widowed. So many people homeless. And it was against that backdrop that our founding fathers got together and tried to build a document a document which would be scripture for a nation which could continue its business and move into being a sovereign democratic republic. The preamble of the Constitution says it, that we, the people of India, having solemnly resolved to constitute India into a sovereign democratic republic and ensuring for its citizens liberty, equality, justice, do adopt, enact, and give ourselves this Constitution. What does the preamble mean? The preamble basically means, in a particular way of saying, it defines our azadi for us. Azadi is not alien to the Constitution. Right from the beginning, it is a free people who, through their representatives, drew up a charter, drew up a mechanism to administer, run this country, and in that document built the framework for the future. And not many people really expected India to survive as a constitutional democracy. And it is amazing that for these 68 years, except for a brief break, we have survived working this Constitution, trying this Constitution, and at each stage redefining both our rights, our responsibilities, and the duty of the state. Now the point is that in the Constitution is a very elaborate document. We have the longest Constitution in the world. And why is it? Unlike Napoleon, who said, a Constitution should be short and ambiguous, so that you can read anything that you want into it. The American Constitution is also a remarkably short document. The British probably did a sensible thing. They never wrote a constitution. It was only in 1990 that they came out with a Charter of Rights. But we, having for maybe a millennium not exactly been used to people ruling themselves, of people having a contract or a compact with their rulers, we decided that we would write everything down. So we wrote down detailed provisions that this is how the center will behave with the states, this is how there will be a Supreme Court, this is how there will be a Comptroller and Auditor General, a Union Public Service Commission. Almost everything was provided in the Constitution. But these were the architecture of a state, of how would state machinery interact with each other. But how would the state interact with the citizen? When it came to the interaction of the state with the citizen, you basically come down to the early chapters of the Constitution, the chapter which defines who a citizen is, the chapter on fundamental rights, and then there is the directive principles of state policy, as well as now we have the fundamental duties which have been put into the Constitution during the emergency. As if you see, the fundamental duties in the emergency had, even they spoke about our fundamental duty to cherish the values, the noble ideas of our freedom struggle. So what are these ideas? What are these values? If I were to put it in one brief word or a brief sentence, the fundamental value that we fought for in our freedom struggle was the idea that we could speak the truth to our rulers the way we saw it. Satya and Ahimsa, the fundamental principle on which the Mahatma led this struggle. He did not lead this struggle so that one set of rulers one set of brown rulers replaced the white rulers. He led a struggle for a nation where the mind was without fear and the head held high. However, what happened in actual practice was this, that the rulers, when they came in, they said, here, we have the constitution, we'll go by it. We will go by it, but essentially, nothing much has changed. We will continue to administer. We will not necessarily rule with consent. Our right to rule, as it were, is subject to your right to elect us from time to time. Please, we are a democracy in as much as we have elections every 5 years, but at the end, between those 5 years, don't ask too many questions. That is, to my mind at least, the way this country has been administered over the past 60 odd years. I'm not saying that everything happened only after May 2014. It has happened continually because every government seems to be more or less obsessed with the problem of how do we continue tomorrow? How do we keep this nation under check? That is what the architecture of a constitutional state that we have. In this context, you see, our Bill of Rights, our fundamental rights, which we put in, which we gave ourselves in Chapter 3 of the Constitution. Sorry, is there something which can be done now? Or it's just the wind? So, I hope I'm not blowing too much wind. No, so these fundamental rights, which were written, were not seen as a no-go area for administrators or as the inherent right of the citizen. These were seen, unfortunately, as some rights which were written in a document somewhere, which a citizen had to fight for to enforce. You have a fundamental right to speak, but constantly we are being told that the fundamental right to speak is subject to reasonable restrictions. I am sorry, that's not how the Constitution has it. That is a lazy paraphrasing of the constitutional provision. And since I'm in JNU, let me pull out my own little red book. It's called the Constitution of India. It's also a little red book. And, sorry. You see, my little red book tells me out here this concept of reasonable restrictions. Reread the provision again. All citizens shall have the right to freedom of speech and expression, to assemble peaceably and without arms, to form associations or unions, to move freely throughout the territory of India, to reside and settle in any part of the territory of India, to practice any profession or to carry on any occupation, trade or business. We had one more right, the right to own, hold and dispose of property. That has vanished. I'll come back, I'll tell you more about it later. But now we come to the concept which everybody, every administration puts against us. No, you have these rights, but we can always restrict it. What does it say? Nothing in subclause A of clause 1 shall affect the operation of any existing law or prevent the state from making any law insofar as such law imposes reasonable restrictions on the exercise of the right conferred by the said clause in the interests of the sovereignty and integrity of India, security of state, friendly relations with foreign states, public order, decency, morality, or in respect of contempt of court, defamation, or incitement to an offense. My God, what a list. What a huge list of no-goes. There are reasonable restrictions. We can make reasonable restrictions. But the point when you say reasonable restrictions is that you emphasize on the restriction and you forget the right. Now reread the section. Reread the article. Insofar as the law imposes reasonable restrictions on the exercise of the right, you cannot have restrictions which take away the right altogether. For most of constitutional history, we have been focusing on the restriction to the extinction of the right. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is precisely the problem. I believe here you had some protest, somebody came by, somebody said something, and suddenly, how can you say that? That is sedition, that is anti-national. We can have reasonable restrictions. We can prevent you from speaking. No, sir, that is not how it is. Way back in 1952, in the early years of the Republic, we had the case of V.G. Rao. Now, V.G. Rao was a lawyer, he was the son of a judge, he was a barrister, and he was a communist. He was a trade union leader in Madras. In Madras, he had what was called the People's Education Society. And the government wanted to shut it down because it was more or less in tune with communist ideals. In the early years of the Republic, in the early years of constitutional interpretation, there were two broad streams of challengers. One broad stream of challengers were on issues of freedoms, fundamental freedoms, and those came basically from the left. There was also a great series of challenges from the right, because at the heart of every debate in the Supreme Court were property rights. So one of the first challenges came in V.G. Rao's case. And here the court explained the distinction as to what is a reasonable restriction. There is a classic passage of Chief Justice Patanjali Shastri. How do you judge what is a reasonable restriction? Justice Shastri says, the nature of the right alleged to have been infringed, the underlying purpose of the restrictions imposed, the extent and urgency of the evil sought to be remedied thereby, the disproportion of the imposition, the prevailing conditions at the time should all enter into the judicial verdict. Now, if you decode that, basically, Justice Shastri and the Supreme Court asks, what is the right? What is the restriction? What is the problem? Is the restriction necessary? Why now? These are the basic questions. And these are the basic questions which are almost never ever asked by administrators. Administrators want it easy. They say, you see, in the Constitution, in the Constituent Assembly debates, there was a Mr. Larry who basically put his finger on the problem, and he said that the fundamental rights appear to have been drawn from the point of view of a policeman, of a police constable. Oh, okay, these are rights. Okay, these are areas where I should generally not touch. But unfortunately, the way we continued administering the state, the Union of India, and the various states was okay. What was it that the previous administrators before independence did? Let us continue it. We are, after all, in one sense, interested in keeping an orderly society. The maintenance of law and order, that became the primary focus of the state. Even today, your finance minister tells you that you can say anything, but you will not say X, Y, and Z. Every lawyer who ends up as an administrator seems to more or less push the envelope a bit more in shutting the doors of freedom in this country. And we have had a long history of lawyers, way back from the emergency when you had Siddharth Shankar Ray and Mr. H.R. Gokhale, who told Mrs. Gandhi to impose the emergency. We've had other lawyers from time to time getting their lawyerly instincts of winning a case somehow triumph over the interests of the citizenry. And the finance minister has been a decent friend, but nevertheless, he is one more in the long list of lawyers who have both fought for freedom in this country as well as have worked towards the abrogation of freedom. And among all these men of law, as it were, you have the ultimate lawyers, the Supreme Court. Because after all, the judges in the Supreme Court do not descend from the heavens. They are lawyers, they become judges, and in due course of time, somewhere around touching the age of 60 or so, they float up to the Supreme Court, they stay there for about 5 years, and they, in effect, are the guardians of your constitutional rights. I'm being realistic here when I tell you that the liberty of the citizen, the liberty of every Indian, is in the hands of 60-year-old men. And in one sense, it is good. The passions of youth, the extremities of youth do not necessarily come in. They have had the wisdom of years. But in the other sense, you see, these 60-year-old men tend to be rather rigid. And very often when faced with issues which have to be decided, they often say, okay, here, this much is yours, let's split the difference. Often that is what constitutional adjudication is about. And therefore, let me just take you through a brief history of constitutional issues which came before the court from the 50s to the present day, just to tell you that the Constitution is a living document which is interpreted by these 60-year-old men and is a constant interpretation arising out of various conflicts that arise from time to time. I told you earlier that among the greatest conflicts which arose in the early years of the Constitution was the fight over property rights. When we wrote the Constitution, we put in the right to hold and to dispose it of. It was your property. But in the early years, the state needed to get in land reforms. The state needed to see that the means of production were available to more and more. The state thought that the greatest good of the greatest number could be achieved by redistribution. So, right from the beginning, there was always a fight over, okay, the state can take over property, but it has to give me compensation. And that compensation should be reasonable. The state constantly said, no, it is not real. I just have to give you compensation. I can take over the entire JNU admin block and compensate you by giving you a little shop outside Ganga Dhaba. That was the extent of disproportion. And each time the court, the Supreme Court struck it down, in the bank nationalization case or the Privy Purses case, the politicians went back and rewrote the constitution. Our constitution being such a long constitution, at each stage, they kept on writing amendments to it. So, to keep things out of judicial hands or out of judicial verdicts. And it is precisely because the politician thought that he could rewrite the constitution at will, and that the courts were then obliged to interpret the rewritten constitution, that somehow this focus on fundamental rights or the rights of the citizen were slowly lost, slowly eroded. That is why, again, restrictions started eating up the right. Now, as far as the right to property was concerned, it finally led in 1973 to the great case of Keshavananda Bharati, where the entire Supreme Court, 13 judges of them, sat and finally decided, yes, Parliament, you can amend the law, you can amend the Constitution, but you cannot change the Constitution's basic structure. They put a fetter on the politicians' power, a fetter which to the mind of many could not be put, because after all, Parliament represents the will of the people. Parliament is given the job of lawmaking, and the Constitution is after all supreme law. Why should Parliament not be able to amend every part of it? That is what constitutional scholars in many countries think. But no, we have said no. Parliament, we know what you are capable of. We know that our citizens require to be protected. So while you can amend, you can't go and touch the basic structure, you can't damage it, you cannot abrogate it. That one decision of April 24th, 1973 has probably done much greater good to democracy in this country than any other act. You see, two things happened on that day, April 24th, 1973, which went towards the making of a united India. One was Keshavananda Bharati. Any idea what was the other? Yes, I heard it. Sachin Tendulkar was born on that day. See, it is like that. There are many things that bind this nation together. The law binds this country. Cricket binds, Bollywood binds. We have many a thing that binds us. But there is also many a thing that divides us. And in our history, continually, we have this habit of accentuating our differences, of saying, no, this is what differentiates me from my fellow man, and therefore I should be treated differently. That is exactly one of the problems that we face today also, because everybody is intent on not only defining himself, but on defining the other man. If you say slogan X, you are national. If you say slogan Y, you are anti-national. Anyway, this thing of trying to define people and conflicts is somewhat tempered by what by the judicial process. Because ultimately, every quarrel which has constitutional dimensions ends up reaching the courts. After 1973, once Keshavananda was written into stone, as it were, by the judges of that time, immediately something happened. The calls for a committed judiciary. The calls for a committed judiciary increased. Three of the judges who gave that judgment on the majority side, saying that Parliament, you do not have a right to go beyond, they got superseded, and that at the same point of time led to other conflicts till in 1975 we had the emergency. Now the emergency also, there are a few memories. I was a very small boy. I was 10 years old when my father came in home and told my mother, Indira Gandhi has become a dictator. I didn't really know what. 2 years later, I could see the dancing in the streets as people were counting the loss in Raebareli, the loss in Amethi. But between those 2 years, there was a feeling. There was a feeling that you could not speak, that you could not even whisper anything against the government of the day. Mr. Fali Nariman, in his book, has a very interesting story of what the Supreme Court looked at that point of time. The former Attorney General, Mr. Daftari, was standing in the corridors, going away at his pipe, stamping it away. Mr. S.T. Desai, who was another stalwart of that time, walked by, looked at Mr. Daftari and said, Chandubai, bolo. Now, Mr. Daftari just looked around, all around, quietly, went again at his pipe and says, Pehla tame bolo. Speak first. Mr. Nariman also tells us of the difference in judicial attitude. Just before the emergency, he as Additional Solicitor General was opposing the grant of bail to some foreign exchange rector or something. The judges of the day said, no, it is the liberty of the citizen. Immediately release him subject to condition X, Y, or Z. During the emergency, when he had resigned and he had gone on the other side, and he was asking those very same judges, it is the liberty of the citizen, please release him. The judges said, no, we shall have to ask the government. Let the government put its reply. We can't release like that. The point that Mr. Nariman told me, and which I also seem to make, is the court is also very often not immune to politics. It is not immune to the great waves of sentiment of the day that lashed this country. The emergency, thankfully, lasted 2 years and went off. Once the emergency was lifted, no, sorry, there's one more story of the emergency days that I have to tell you. And that story is the saddest story of the Supreme Court. During the emergency, many a person was detained under preventive detention. Many of them came to various courts, various high courts, which said release them. The government came up in appeal. Before the Supreme Court, when the case came up, the government argued a proposition which was logical, which was a lawyer's argument. They said, look, what is it that the Constitution promises? The Constitution promises the right to life and liberty. That a person's life to right and liberty will not be taken away except with procedure given by law. That is Article 21. Today, during the emergency, Article 21 stands suspended. There is no 21 in this constitution. Because there is no 21 in this constitution, there is no right which the citizen can invoke. One of the judges asked the Attorney General, that means, Mr. Attorney, if a policeman takes me out and shoots me, do I have no recourse? The Attorney General of the day said, no. Consistent with my argument, no. At that point of time, not many lawyers, even in those dark days, believed that the Supreme Court would swallow such an argument. Some of the greatest judges of this country were on that bench. But by a majority of 4:1, the Supreme Court in ADM Jabalpur's case said yes, as long as the emergency persists, there is no right in India to life and liberty, and therefore we cannot enforce anything. Among those judges were the great Justice Bhagwati, the great Justice Chandrachud, the only judge who dissented and whose portrait even today is out there in the court that he sat in court number 2, Justice H.R. Khanna, said, no, this can never be. Fundamental rights in the Constitution are a recognition of the inalienable rights of man. They are inherent in every human being. They are inherent in every citizen of India. But that was what the court was in those times. And it was largely as a result of guilt over this judgment during the emergency that after emergency was lifted, you had a flowering. You had public interest litigation coming up. You had the court, in Justice Krishna Iyer's words, looking out for the loneliest, the lost, and the last. Those blinded in Bhagalpur in Bihar came to this court. The court tried to help them out. There were under trials who had spent more than their maximum term in prison. The court said, open wide the gates. But all this was largely a result of the court being extra conformist, of the court having abdicated and surrendered in a period of crisis. So then, through the 80s, you had this court in a huge expansion. Towards the end of the 80s, in our political life came two great movements. You had Mandal on one side and you had the Mandir on the other. Again, in the mid-90s, the court came out in Mandal and more or less put its seal on what the government had done, subject to one condition, that those who have availed the benefits of reservation, but are not exactly deprived, the creamy layer, eliminate them insofar as OBC reservation. The court did a balancing act in '93. As far as the Mandir was concerned, however, that is a problem which the court had chosen in the 90s not to look at it, because there was a direct reference by the government, a presidential reference, which asked the Supreme Court to determine whether in fact there was a Mandir under the masjid. The court said no, Ayodhya is a passing storm, the honor and dignity of the Supreme Court cannot be compromised. They said no, if you filed a civil suit which is continuing in Allahabad, let the civil suit decide it, thereafter we'll take it in appeal. As you know, Allahabad has decided and the matter is still pending. There's some matters where the court has, as a matter of policy, decided not to look into the problem immediately. Sometimes kicking the can down the road, sometimes waiting for a more opportune time, is always good in any legal cause. You can tell that the judges are still lawyers, because they too, from time to time, in inconvenient matters, look for adjournments. So, after we had Mandal Mandir, then we come to the decade of the 2000s, and this is when liberalization has more or less taken root in India. The Supreme Court, in this period of the 2000s, did a few things with which many of you may or may not agree. One of the things that it tried to do was to help the privatization of education. In the TMA Pai judgment, 11 judges got together and said that, look, as far as minority educational institutions are concerned, they can do what they want, largely. You cannot interfere with them except for good administration only. The court also upheld liberalization, privatization in Balco. The court did quite a few other things also. But the general tendency of the courts, after that initial phase of expansion of public interest litigation, of looking at the poor, is to have turned much more conservative. In economic matters, hands off. In social matters, unless it's very pressing, we will look at it if we feel like it. That seems to be the attitude. The last case that I would like to tell you about is a very recent case. The case essentially is one of the few cases where the Supreme Court has actually struck a blow for free speech. I refer to Shreya Singh's case. You all know that these days we rarely talk like this. We all go to our smartphones, we go to our computers, our laptops, and we write whatever we want. Our speech is in the form of Facebook, Twitter, and other posts. Now, there was a section in the Information Technology Act which said if it was grossly offensive, it was criminal. Mr. Nariman, I spoke about earlier, his son Rohington Nariman is a judge of the Supreme Court right now. In a far-reaching judgment, he struck down this overbroad section 66A. He said that there is no crime if you write something which may or may not cause annoyance. And when it came to speech, he made a great distinction. The distinction is that when we speak, I speak to you first to just inform. Sometimes I speak to you to advocate things. Both these varieties of speech, there can be no restraint whatsoever. When you inform or when you advocate, nothing. But when you step further into the realm of incitement, go there, do that. Go there, burn down that house. Go there and hit those anti-nationals. That is where you go over the border to incitement, and that is where the only area where the law can come in, where the law can regulate. See, my idea of, in telling you the journey of the Supreme Court through a few cases, is to largely tell you that cases and issues come to the court sometimes out of trivial incidents, but very large principles are decided by our constitutional guardians, our sentinels on the qui-vie, which basically means that these judges are charged with the duty of looking out for you, looking out for your rights, and enforcing your rights even against the state. The question often is getting your case up to them. Because a large number of causes arise, but rarely come to the courts. Many a person does not have the means to approach the court. And this is where, in a constitutional democracy, people like you, people like me, have a role to play, have a role to change, have a role to make our Azadi much more meaningful. This is where we have to decide whether the Azadi that is written in our constitution is also there in our constitution, in the way that we are constituted, in the way where we decide that what is wrong, what is unjust, and that we will maintain it not through the force of arms, not through the blows of the mob, but through recourse to constitutional means. We have a mechanism which may be old, which may be creaking, but after all, that is the only mechanism that we have. That is the way that our constitutional guarantee of Azadi has to be enforced. That is the path of constitutional democracy that Ambedkar wrote about when he said that we have to give up the anarchy of the past to step into a constitutional democracy. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for a very patient hearing. Jai Hind.